72 hours. That is how long it took General George S. Patton to capture Palermo, the capital of Sicily, after his forces began their drive on July 20th, 1943. Italian military commanders watching the advance from their headquarters were not panicking. They were waiting. They believed Patton had just made the kind of error that ends careers and costs armies. He had driven his forces 100 miles into the interior of the island at maximum speed, stretched his supply lines to the point where a determined counterattack could cut them, exposed his eastern flank to an Italian force that still numbered in the tens of thousands, and captured a city that had no direct bearing on the road to Messina, which was the only exit the German and Italian armies had left. The Italian commanders had studied Patton. They had a plan. They believed they were about to watch an American general destroy himself. They were wrong about almost everything. We're going to tell you everything about what happened next, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with what was actually in those files. And then we'll get into what it means. This was not supposed to reach the public. The Italian military's internal assessments of Patton's Sicilian campaign, the specific command documents, the situation reports, the evaluations of American strategy that Italian officers produced during and after the fighting, were held in archives that Western historians could not access systematically until decades after the war. The Italian military establishment had reasons of its own for not publicizing its analysis of a campaign that ended in the complete collapse of its forces on the island. When those documents were finally examined, they revealed something that the standard accounts of the Sicily campaign had not fully captured: the specific way Italian commanders had read Patton's actions, and the specific reasons they had concluded he was making a fatal mistake. Here is what they found. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, began on the night of July 9th and 10th, 1943, with airborne drops followed by amphibious landings along the island's southern coast. Two Allied armies came ashore: the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery, landing in the southeast, and the American 7th Army under Patton, landing to Montgomery's left in the south-central sector. The strategic plan, as designed by Allied command, was straightforward in conception and secondary in its assignment of roles. Montgomery's 8th Army was the main effort. His forces would advance up the eastern coast of the island along the main road toward Messina, the Sicilian city at the northeastern tip of the island, separated from the Italian mainland by a 3-mile strait. Taking Messina would cut off the Axis forces on Sicily and prevent their evacuation. Patton's 7th Army would protect Montgomery's left flank and advance in a supporting role, keeping pace with the British advance without drawing resources from the main effort. Patton accepted this assignment in writing. In private, he regarded it as the kind of role given to commanders who were not trusted with the main effort, and he was right that this was what it reflected. His reputation from North Africa was that of a man who could be effective and who could also be reckless, and Allied command under General Dwight Eisenhower had decided, in the division of responsibility for Sicily, that the British Army with the more consistent record would carry the principal burden. Patton was to protect the flank. He understood this. He did not intend to accept it any longer than the situation required. The Italian military situation on Sicily in July 1943 was complicated in ways that the standard histories have sometimes simplified. Italy was in its third year of a war that had not gone as its leadership had anticipated at any point. The North Africa campaign, which had ended in catastrophic defeat for the Axis in May 1943, had cost Italy substantial military resources and considerably more political credibility. The Italian army that defended Sicily was a mixture of regular army units, garrison forces, and coastal defense divisions, troops who varied considerably in quality, equipment, and motivation. The regular army units, particularly those with combat experience, were capable. The coastal defense formations were not, and this was known both to the Italians themselves and, through intelligence, to the Allies. The overall Axis command in Sicily was divided between Italian General Alfredo Guzzoni, who commanded the 6th Army responsible for the island's defense, and German General Hans Valentin Hube, who commanded the German forces. The division of command was a source of friction from the start. The Germans did not defer to Guzzoni's authority in the way the formal command structure required. Guzzoni understood this and worked around it where he could. What he produced, in the first weeks of July,
was a defensive plan that concentrated the strongest forces, primarily German armored and motorized units, in the center of the island and on the road network leading to Messina, with Italian forces holding the flanks and the coastal areas. The plan was defensible on paper. Its weakness was that it assumed the Allied forces would attack in a way that was responsive to the plan. The moment that opened the door came from an unexpected direction.
Montgomery's advance up the eastern coast of Sicily had stalled in front of German defensive positions near Catania, positions that the Germans had chosen and prepared with the specific purpose of blocking the main road to Messina. The Eighth Army could not move through them quickly. Montgomery requested, and received, permission to swing part of his forces west and use roads that had been assigned to the American sector. This decision, tactically defensible, operationally significant, meant that American units in the center had to stop advancing to let the British forces cross their front. It was the kind of arrangement that, in the polite language of Allied command, was described as a coordination measure. Patton described it in his diary with language that was not polite and has since become well documented in every biography written about him. He went to see General Harold Alexander, the British officer who commanded 15th Army Group and served as Eisenhower's ground commander for the Sicily operation. He made the argument that a static American army sitting on a flank while British forces used American roads was not a productive use of the forces available. He proposed an alternative. Alexander, who had his own pressures and his own understanding of what Patton was capable of when given room to operate, gave him limited approval to expand his operations. On July 19th, Patton requested permission from the Allied command to detach a substantial portion of his forces and drive them north and west through the Sicilian interior toward Palermo. The rationale he offered was operational. Capturing Palermo would collapse Italian resistance in western Sicily, secure the island's principal port for Allied use, and eliminate the threat from Italian forces on the western flank before the main drive toward Messina began. The argument was reasonable. It was also the argument Patton needed to make to escape the flank protection role he had been assigned. Allied command gave him permission. The drive began the following morning. What Guzzoni and his staff saw on July 20th was an American armored column moving at a speed that the Italian defensive plan had not accounted for. The plan had assumed a methodical American advance, the kind of advance that allowed defensive forces time to reposition, to establish blocking positions, to coordinate counterattacks with the German armor in the center. What was happening instead was a rush. Patton's forces were moving at 30 and 40 miles per day through terrain that conventional military doctrine said should slow any force to a fraction of that pace. The Italian assessment, produced in the situation reports that have since been declassified, was that Patton's speed was his vulnerability. A force moving that fast accumulates risk in specific ways. Supply lines extend and thin. Flanks go unprotected. Units at the front outrun their supporting artillery and logistics. The Italian commanders who analyzed the American advance on those maps in July of 1943 saw an extended column with an exposed right flank and a supply situation that a determined counterattack in the right place could sever. They began planning that counterattack. They had forces available in western Sicily, not the first-rate units, but sufficient numbers that, properly positioned and timed, could cut the American supply route and leave the lead elements of Patton's drive isolated and unsupplied 80 miles inside enemy territory. The counterattack required two things: time to organize the forces, and a moment when the American advance had extended far enough that the cut would be decisive. Italian commanders believed they had both. They began moving their available forces into position. If you think this story deserves to be heard, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps us keep bringing these stories to the people who need to hear them. The gap between what Italian command believed and what was happening on the ground in western Sicily in those days is one of the most documented disconnects in the Italian military record of the entire war. Part of the reason it is documented is that it happened at multiple levels simultaneously. At the divisional command level, at the regimental level, at the level of individual companies who were supposed to be holding ground and were not. The Italian soldiers who made up the western Sicily garrison were not, for the most part, men who had chosen to be in this position at this time. Italy's mobilization had been comprehensive and had reached deep into the civilian population. The men defending the western part of the island included farmers from Calabria, fishermen from the coastal towns, workers from the northern industrial cities who had been assigned to units in the south by the Army's replacement system. Some of them had been in uniform for 4 years. Some had seen combat in Libya or in the Balkans. Most of them understood, in the way that soldiers understand things they are not officially told, that the war was not going well, and that the island they were defending had become important to the outcome in ways that were difficult to explain in terms of their individual survival. What they did not have, and what their planning had not accounted for, was what was happening to Italian soldiers on the ground in western Sicily in those same days. The news that Patton was moving had reached the Italian units in the west before any orders from Guzzoni did. The speed of the American advance was not just a logistical phenomenon, it was a psychological one. Italian units that had been prepared to hold their positions found themselves confronted with a situation that moved faster than the command network could address. Orders from headquarters arrived describing a situation that no longer existed by the time the orders reached the front. Counterattack positions that had been designated on maps were occupied by American forces by the time Italian units were attempting to reach them. The coherence of the defensive plan, which required that each unit know where the adjacent units were and what they were doing, began to dissolve as communication lagged behind events. Italian soldiers who had no personal investment in the outcome, men who had joined the coastal defense forces under circumstances that had little to do with ideological commitment, began to make individual calculations. Some units tried to fight. Many did not. The surrender rate in western Sicily in the final week of July was extraordinary, not because American forces overwhelmed them in direct combat, but because the speed of the advance made organized resistance seem impossible before it had actually become impossible. The counterattack that Italian command was organizing depended on units being where the maps said they were. The maps were wrong. The port question mattered in a way that became clear in the week after the city's capture. Allied supply operations during the Sicily campaign had been running through the beaches and through smaller southern ports, whose capacity was limited by the distance from the Allied logistical base in North Africa and by the volume of material that a modern army in active operations required. Palermo's port, the largest on the island, with facilities that could handle the kind of tonnage the Seventh Army needed, changed the supply arithmetic in a specific and practical way. The American forces that would fight for the next several weeks in the northern and northeastern parts of Sicily would be supplied through Palermo rather than across the beaches of the south. This was not a symbolic consideration. It was a logistical one, and it mattered in every subsequent engagement. Palermo fell on July 22nd. When Patton's forces entered the city, they found a situation the Italian command had not modeled. A population that was not hostile, infrastructure that was largely intact, and a port that would be usable for Allied supply operations within days. The Italian garrison had not fought for the city in the way that a city of its importance might have been defended. The psychological momentum of the preceding week had made the defense of Palermo feel, to the men who were supposed to conduct it, like a gesture without a likely outcome. Guzzoni's position by July 22nd was one of a commander who had been outmaneuvered not by superior firepower, but by superior tempo. The German armor that was supposed to be the island's decisive defensive element had been positioned to stop a thrust toward the eastern coastal road. It had done that. Montgomery's advance was stalled. But the American operation was not happening where the armor was. Guzzoni had asked Hube to reposition German forces to address the western situation, and had been effectively told that the German priority was the Catania line and the road to Messina. The Germans were already thinking about how to get their forces off the island. Guzzoni was still trying to hold it. The two priorities were not the same priority, and the command structure did not resolve that tension cleanly. Guzzoni understood by July 22nd that the western half of the island was lost. He had been trying to organize a counterattack while the ground was shifting beneath it, and the counterattack had not materialized in time. What he had to work with now was the eastern sector, the road to Messina, the German armor that Hube was managing with the specific priority of extracting his forces intact rather than holding the island. Guzzoni's military problem had become a different problem than the one his plan had addressed. The post-war Italian military assessments, the formal analyses that officers produced in the 1940s and 1950s as part of the process of understanding what had happened, are direct about what they concluded. The assessment that Patton had made a fatal mistake by driving to Palermo was wrong. The mistake in the Italian analysis was not identifying Patton's actual objective. The objective was not Palermo, the city. The objective was the psychological condition of Italian forces in western Sicily, and that objective was achieved by the pace of the advance before any Italian unit had fired a shot at an American vehicle on the road to Palermo. The Italian analysts noted, with a directness that reflects how much time had passed between the events and the writing, that the Italian defensive plan had been built on assumptions about how fast American forces would move and how much disruption the Italian command network could tolerate before it lost coherence. Both assumptions were wrong. Patton had moved faster than the plan allowed for, and had moved in a way that made the command network irrelevant by making the tactical situation change faster than orders could address it. What they described, in the language of post-war military analysis, was a theory of operational shock. Not the shock of a specific explosion or a specific loss, but the shock of a situation moving faster than an organization can process. An army that cannot communicate faster than its enemy can advance is an army whose plan has already failed before it has been executed. This is what Patton understood, and what Italian command, in July of 1943, did not. The race to Messina that followed the fall of Palermo has been written about primarily as a competition between Patton and Montgomery, the famous rivalry between the American and British generals, the determination on both sides to be the first to take the city whose capture would end the campaign. Patton reached Messina on August 17th, hours before the British. Montgomery's route along the eastern coast had been blocked by determined German resistance in a way that Patton's northern coastal route, opened by the capture of Palermo and the collapse of Italian resistance in the west, had not. The German evacuation of Sicily across the Messina Strait, approximately 40,000 German troops and 60,000 Italian troops moved to the mainland before the Allied armies arrived, is the part of the Sicilian campaign that Allied commanders, historians, and the participants themselves found most difficult to explain satisfactorily afterward. The armies had been too slow to cut off the evacuation. The specific reason Patton's forces could not close the Messina pocket in time involves a set of command decisions and coordination failures that are distinct from the story of his drive to Palermo. What the drive to Palermo did was open the northern road and collapse Italian resistance in a way that should, in theory, have given the Allied armies the position to prevent the evacuation. The translation of that position into an actual blocking action did not happen in time. This is the element that Italian military historians, when they examined the Sicilian campaign in the post-war decades, found most instructive. Patton's maneuver had been correct. The execution that followed had not been sufficient to exploit it fully. The Italian commanders who had believed Patton was making a fatal mistake had been wrong about the maneuver and right about only one thing. The campaign did not end with the encirclement and destruction of the Axis forces on Sicily. It ended with a contested evacuation that cost the Axis time and equipment, but not the bulk of its experienced personnel. The men who crossed the Messina Strait went on to fight in Italy and in France. The campaign that was supposed to collapse Axis resistance in the Mediterranean theater did not do that. He also understood something that the official histories have been slow to capture clearly. The race to Messina was not primarily about the competition with Montgomery, though the competition was real and Patton cared about it intensely. It was about demonstrating that the American army could move at a pace and with an operational sophistication that justified giving it a primary role in the campaigns that were coming. Italy was next. France would follow. The decisions about which commander would lead the main effort in those campaigns were not yet made, and how the American army performed in Sicily would influence those decisions. Patton was not racing to Messina for its own sake. He was racing to Messina to prove something about what the Seventh Army could do, and he was racing with the knowledge that the proof would matter in rooms he was not in. The Italian commanders who had been preparing to destroy him in late July understood none of this. They were reading a military map and identifying vulnerabilities that were real on the map. What the map did not show was the speed differential that made those vulnerabilities theoretical rather than practical. A vulnerability that cannot be exploited in time is not a vulnerability. It is a feature of the terrain that one side can use and the other cannot reach. Patton understood this. He said so in the private documents that were released after his death. He believed that the opportunity to close the strait had been available and had been lost, and that the loss had consequences for how long the war in the Mediterranean would last. The assessment was not wrong. The Italian officers who had spent July of 1943 preparing a counterattack that never happened did not write extensively about their experience in ways that reached the public record. The post-war Italian military establishment had limited appetite for detailed examinations of campaigns that ended in collapse and armistice, and the officers who had commanded in Sicily tended toward silence on the specifics. What reached the archives was the formal staff analysis, the after-action documents, the campaign studies, and these are what historians worked from when the archives opened. Those documents describe men who were trying to fight a war with tools that the situation had made inadequate. The command network that Guzzoni had built was a real network, designed for real military purposes, and it failed not because it was incompetently built, but because it was operating against a commander who moved faster than any network of that era could respond to. That is a specific lesson, and Italian military historians drew it specifically, and it appears in the professional literature of the Italian military in the 1950s in language that is careful and precise, and notably free of excuses. The men on the ground in western Sicily in July of 1943, the Italian soldiers who had been in position to conduct the counterattack that was supposed to destroy Patton's exposed supply lines, remember the sound of vehicles they could not catch. They remember the dust on the roads of the Sicilian interior that told them something was moving faster than the orders said it should be moving. They remember the moment the orders stopped making sense, because the situation the orders described was already 3 hours in the past. They remember putting down their weapons in the heat of a Sicilian July afternoon and understanding that the calculation had changed in a way that no one had told them to expect. Now you know what was in the file. Did your family come from Sicily or serve in the Mediterranean theater? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.